Thank you so much for joining us today for this very important, albeit difficult conversation about no space for racism, and then specifically how you as member firms of the Diversity Project and some of our allies, firms and partners can deepen and develop community within your own organizations. When the racially inspired riots happened in Britain at the start of August, several people contacted me and said, oh, the Diversity Project should put out a statement condemning the violence. And of course, along with everybody else, I think, was horrified by what had happened, and in particular, how it might affect people from the communities that were being targeted. But I also was reluctant just to put out some form of grandstanding statement and to kind of put out a statement without actually doing anything. And over the ensuing weeks, we had a number of firms and members contact us and say, could you help us with communications around these issues? Could you help us with helping our employees, some of whom feel very threatened and concerned about what's happened and who feel personally targeted or unsure about how to handle these issues? Can you help us help them? So today's webinar is a starting point for that. It's not going to be one and done in one webinar, but we hope that by talking about some of the lived experiences some people at our firms have experienced, but also having some expert views in our second panel from those who spend time, who work with the communities affected, but also who've been spending time helping firms deal with these types of issues. We hope that we will be setting the ball rolling, as it were, and afterwards the Diversity Project will be issuing, if not a communique, that sounds very grand again, but some form of guidance to help firms. But also we would expect this to be very much a living and breathing document, and something where we would welcome case studies and examples being shared, again, in the interest that we can all help to support each other and those colleagues who feel undermined or threatened by what is happening and I'm afraid might continue to happen. The first panel is three gentlemen who have kindly volunteered, I hope they don't feel press gang by me, to share their lived experiences, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. And we have someone who is Muslim, someone who is Jewish, and someone who is Black, and they're going to talk about their different experiences, particularly over the recent past, but also longer term, and also talk about the positive things that they've seen happen that have helped. And then we'll move on to a panel which Lucas Klein, who's head of EMEA and APAC equities at Janus Henderson Investors, is going to moderate. Thank you in advance, Lucas, for stepping forward to do that. And this is a group of experts who, work, as I said earlier, work with companies to help them to overcome the challenges that are intrinsic to these issues, and to help their colleagues feel more supported and feel more secure.
How we respond to crises, whether internal or external, will have an impact on our ability to attract, retain, develop, and motivate diverse talent. Could you please give our listeners an overview of the social context for the race riots and the general unrest in the UK, and why the organizational response had such a profound effect?
So in addition to being a lawyer, I go into mostly regulated firms, whether it be finance, accounting, or law, and I do training on things such as DEI, allyship, intersectionality. And when I do that training, what I'm getting a lot now, people saying, I'm too scared to talk about these issues. So I know these things are happening, but I'm so fearful of saying the wrong thing and being cancelled or castigated for saying the wrong thing. And this all creates a melting point of distrust, concern, apathy, and anger, which I think boiled over somewhat into the race riot. So I wasn't that surprised by it, if I be honest. A lot of good work has been done. As you heard from the last panel, we have organizations having far greater affinity groups. They have DEI committees. When I became a lawyer, DEI wasn't even a term in existence. It wasn't something that was talked about, even though I've always been a unicorn of 1 or 2 Black lawyers, despite having lived in London my whole life, where I make up 13.5% of the population. So if we have Black lawyers at the same level around the country in London, how more are we less represented outside of London, where we are in greater numbers? So I think in giving that grade, the issue is that I feel that we are now at the adolescence phase of the DEI journey. And if you've ever dealt with an adolescent, or you remember your teen years, you remember how painful and difficult that was. We had the explosion of DEI committees being set up following the George Floyd's murder. But that can only take you so far. People are getting tired by the fact that change hasn't happened overnight, which is partly causing the apathy. Those who are greatly affected by the issues are also feeling disgruntled and disenfranchised because the rate of change hasn't been at the rate that they wanted. And I feel now is the time to dig in, as opposed to saying, maybe we've tried it and we need to stop using DEI as a terminology. I think now is the time to say, we need to continue educating. We need leaders to lead from the front, to show that vulnerability.
So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Muna and Rachel. You're both experts who run your own racial equity and DEI consultancies. Could you please help us define key terms such as Islamophobia, privilege, and anti-Semitism, just so we're all on the same page, and also help us understand what the impact might be of not being specific in our language?
The term that I'm going to start with, Lucas, is privilege. And I'm going to start with privilege because it's the term that often in spaces evokes a lot of defensiveness and emotional responses, because there's a connotation of unearned privileges or unearned benefits that sit with the individual. And it's really important for us when we're talking about structures and systems that we depersonalize this. So the language that we use within my organization as a starting point is structurally embedded advantage. And we talk about that alongside the language of intersecting identities, because it's really important for us to understand how all of us have multifaceted identities. We have gender, religion, race, sexuality, so on and so forth. And all of those identities are experienced concurrently at the same time to give us a unique experience. And that means that there are structures that are enabled in every organization, in every system that we navigate. That means that a part of our identity is advantaged and another part of our identity may be disadvantaged in those spaces. And in understanding that, people will be able to grasp that when we talk about structurally embedded advantage and we talk about an outcome of that being a set of privileges, that every single one of us has sets of privileges. Those privileges might be different, but it's important that we understand that privilege is an outcome of structurally embedded advantage. It's not something that sits with the individual. It's not something that an individual has choice over and is often unconscious, but it is a tool that we can utilize in an empowering way. So it's not a rod to punish somebody and say you are privileged in some way, but a way for us to reflect and hold ourselves in a position where we can be allies and think about how we can navigate spaces with ease in certain contexts that others may not be able to, and how we utilize that to stand up for somebody or to amplify an issue.
Despite all the progress that has been made in the DEI space, religion still seems like a taboo subject that has been left off the workplace agenda. So if you set aside what I like to call the fun, the food and the festivals that companies might raise awareness of, you know, Diwali is coming up, it's Hanukkah, it's Ramadan. But when I say religion, what words really spring to mind? And for many people, if they're being honest with themselves, religion conjures up words like extreme, ancient, irrelevant, not progressive. And I think there is a real fear. I've seen it with the organizations I've worked with for over 20 years. When it comes to this topic, they're much more hesitant and tentative. There is a real fear that talking about religion in the workplace will end up being political, divisive, offensive, polarizing, having to choose one side at the expense of another. And so many companies think it is easier to just stay silent. And that's wrong. The focus needs to be on education and understanding people. And it is not as simple as acknowledging festivals in your shared company calendar, providing halal or kosher food, and accommodating a space for prayer.
What key themes you'd recommend organizations to focus on when trying to build stronger communities and put their values into action?
So my first point which I want to leave with participants for reflection, is that social disorder can expose or give rise to deep vulnerability. What I mean by that is that societal events can undermine your sense of belonging or your basic sense of safety and security. Many of you will recall that these factors form the base of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Issues such as abuse or alienation may also be encountered on your way to or from work. We've heard graphic examples of that today. A journey undertaken specifically to fulfill obligations to the employing organization. And of course, issues and attitudes prevalent in society and the media may also manifest in an organizational workforce at work. In all of these circumstances, I believe it is unrealistic to expect that a person should simply turn up and perform at work unaffected by societal events. The second argument that I would like to put before you is that engagement, the very act of reaching out and having a dialogue, is very powerful and overcomes many of the harmful effects of a do-nothing approach, something which has been alluded to by my co-panelists today. This is for a number of reasons. Firstly, it validates unprocessed feelings. This allows employees to feel heard and valued and to move on, and that enhances their productivity. It also prevents rumination. It prevents the employee from going over the distressing events or incidents over and over again in their mind, which can cause severe anxiety and low mood, affecting mental health. Having a dialogue and reaching out also affirms the duty of care and the relationship between the organization and the employee, which may be undermined by a failure to engage, and this in turn then, reaching out, boosts staff morale and loyalty. Not engaging with sensitive issues is not a default position, which unfortunately it has become for many organizations, but it is an active, detrimental choice. And the sensitivity of issues should not preclude people from having a dialogue, for example, because sensitive issues can still be addressed, for example, through safe space sessions and employee surveys, leveraging independent practitioners where appropriate to collect anonymized data, have confidential conversations, and inform the senior leadership team. The third argument I want to put before you is that relationships have cycles. So in mediation, we talk about cycles of engagement in relationships. Negative behaviors by one party, such as an organization or its employee, can cause resentment and engender negative behaviors in the future from the other party, resulting in long-term escalation of conflicts. Conversely, dialogue, training programs, networking, and education events, modeling of positive behaviors by the senior leadership team and managers can disrupt negative cycles and promote virtuous cycles of engagement, which will yield results over time. And so my last point on that is have a long-term outlook rather than expecting instant solutions. And I know that a number of people have raised the point today that people have been seen to do things in the short term, but not to follow through. So really, I would encourage people to take a long-term view regarding the initiatives that they take and to build their organizations over time. On that note, my last point, the fourth proposition I want to put before you really, is that culture must be built proactively. What I mean by that is that drawing on your corporate values and implementing training programs proactively means that you are building the culture that you want. You may even wish, for example, to involve employees in outlining and agreeing their mutual responsibilities to each other quite explicitly, what I would term a corporate citizenship charter. And whilst events around you may provide an imperative for short-term actions, if you only react when events occur, you are likely to be dealing with a limited set of issues in an often polarized environment. In other words, your organization is being shaped by events and not by you.
Building on from the excellent summary that Dr. Shafi gave, I think the number one point would be is that DEI has to be a business imperative. It cannot be the thing that is relied upon by those from minoritized groups to take the lead on. It can't be reactive. So every time there's a world event, suddenly an organization is scrambling to get a message out. People need to have this as part of their KPI. Because if you see it as part of your business in which you're going to be judged on for bonuses, promotions, etc., then you will be forward thinking about it and it'll become embedded in all of your work processes. I loved the point that Dr. Shatty made about having a charter. I was going to say there needs to also be something there that people can have respectful conversation. Because as an employment lawyer, I see it when these conversations go wrong. So as much as I want to encourage curiosity and I want to encourage people having frank discussions, there is a legislative framework where if those conversations are not handled appropriately and carefully, it does expose risk. So I do think it is important that managers and all staff are trained on how to have these difficult conversations and that people can also take stock. I think it's also important that when we talk about bringing your authentic self, I always put a little asterisk and say authentic work self, because in a workplace, we have to accept that people will have very strong different views. And therefore, we need to know how to engage in those conversations in a way that remains respectful. So it's not that I'm dismissing the importance of openness and transparency. With everything in life, there need to be boundaries. And particularly as we are moving into a world where, 20 years ago, people didn't have to have this skill set. There still is a very important education piece while people are unlearning. I always say I do DEI work day in, day out. I am not a finished product. I have been listening as much as I've been speaking today because I'm still on a journey. And organizations need to be from top down saying that to people, we are on a journey. Where we get things wrong, we need to be able to get real-time feedback, whether it be through anonymous or affinity groups or however, managers speaking to their staff about it. But we only get all of these rich data when we embed this into our culture, into our systems, and into our organization.
I'm going to return back to the issue of language. There has to be shared literacy in an organization. If you're going to commit to engaging in this work and creating a community within your organization, then the language has to be shared and understood throughout the organization rather than being top down. That means there needs to be space for people to unpack what the terms are that are being used, to be able to articulate and explain what that means within the context of the organization as well. So it's not an abstract term that people are just floating around with. It actually has a real life explanation and an understanding at a very local level for everybody within the organization. And that language then needs to appear in all documents and in all communications throughout the organization every time that issues are being raised and issues are being communicated. And it needs to be embedded, exactly as you said, Fudia, is commitments need to be embedded in the organization. And what do we mean by that? It's one thing for an organization to say that they commit to particular values. It's another thing for employees within that organization to see those commitments put into the policies and the procedures that are embedded within the everyday practice of being in that space. Compassionate leadership is not just looking at a result-based approach to leadership where we're saying we need the numbers to show that there's an improvement. We're looking at tangible outputs. We also need leadership that is focusing on the duty of care to their staff. What does that mean? How are you as a leader enabling your staff to feel as though they can come to you with issues or come to anybody that's in a management role within your organization and know that they will be heard, that their experiences will be valued and will be respected within that space as well in practice. And that comes with training. For anybody that has a management or a line management role, there has to be cultural competency training. There has to be EDI training in order to enable those individuals to build those soft skills.
How can organizations make sure that DEI is embraced throughout the organization? So not just leadership paying lip service to it, but that even in the middle of the organization, that DEI is embraced.
Assuming normalized opinions can often marginalize people. So making a general statement about a group of people based on something, for example, that you've just heard on the news, and it could alienate the whole group of people. And they're equal participants in the meeting, but you have just marginalized them by making a sweeping comment. And they don't feel they've got equal value at the table. So I think that's one thing we need to all be more sensitive to. We've heard obviously about cross-attendance at diversity events. I think this is really important. It's something I'm quite passionate about. When I set up a diversity network, the HR people used to say to me, how do you get such a diverse group of people at your events? We've never seen some of these people before. And I said, well, I go to their events. And it's quite simple. That diversity is not about creating silos for different groups of people to go into and be with like-minded people. It's about putting issues on the table for everyone to benefit from, and really to permeate that exposure, that dialogue, that education throughout the organization, throughout the population. And so everybody needs to participate in all of the diversity events. It's not for specific groups. I think also social events, I think getting to know people as individuals is really important. I think it helps to break down prejudice and ignorance. And I think social events give us opportunities to do that. Again, making sure your social events are inclusive. If you find that particular groups of people don't attend because of the format or the nature of your event, you need everybody there, because it's a chance for everyone to have a voice and to get to know each other, to get to know other people and for people to know them.
Sometimes things have to be a three-line party whip, because we've already talked about the fact that sometimes we're singing to the choir or preaching to the converted. Sometimes I've seen it be very productive where management say everyone is expected unless they've got a good reason not to attend, because and that's why we need leaders to be leading from the front, because it's the same way if you ever do training. If a leader hasn't got their camera on, no one's got their cameras on. The leaders aren't going to these events. People who see it as a can't be bothered, I've got work to do, are less likely to attend. So we need to try and make it as unattractive as possible for people to close their eyes and close their ears to the message. And that might be unattractive because people want to say this, come to this if you're interested. But we need to get to a point where people are hearing the message.
When organizations are wanting to do work that's around diversity and inclusion, the focus is on building community and how do we bring people together and about the culture of an organization. And the most important way to do that is to make sure that everybody feels that their psychological safety and that their well-being is a priority for the organization that they're a part of. And that doesn't just mean in terms of the interpersonal communications that they're having with individuals, but knowing that the organization is taking care of them. And that is really through the reporting mechanisms that are available, making sure that there are safe reporting mechanisms that are put in place so that if somebody is experiencing a microaggression, they know that there is ways in which this can be reported and that they can be supported through that.
Most organizations are secular, right? I mean, we're talking about corporations or not-for-profits. So how do they comment publicly on religious or faith-based issues? Like, what's your advice?
We have talked quite a lot about religion and approaching and everything. There's so many nuanced variables that we've seen after recent event. Do we make a statement? Is it public? Is it internal? Who do we check it with? Everything else. And what I also understood around this, it depends where employees are based, which regions, where your main clients and suppliers are based. As the first panel described, there's no point thinking I've made the statement, it's great, I've done my bit, and then that kind of okay, and everyone's disappeared, and now what? So I think there's the statement thing created, especially after events in the Middle East, a lot of complexities and problems, but actually some of those challenges are still there, and we need to continue to be talking about them.
Dr. Shafi had talked about diversity is not about getting like-minded people together and all agreeing with each other. And of course, I might say, well, that's the whole point of diversity, but I think it does get forgotten about quite often. And it's very important to remember. And this idea that I hope that we have conveyed today of listening to each other, of asking questions of each other, of discussing things openly and listening to each other, developing our empathy and understanding of each other's faiths, backgrounds, other aspects about our colleagues that we might have felt, they might not be interested in us on sharing with us, but actually do enhance our compassion and our humanity. We have so much more in common with each other as human beings than we have differences. And sometimes it can feel that all of these divisions and differences are greatly separating us. Today is, I hope, the start of a very conscious effort on the part of many people to overcome those differences.